Originating from Chico State University, welcome to The Real Issue. We begin our 5-part series on the California Drought, focusing specifically on the North State. This series will explore the politics and economics of the state's water supply. We'll compare the benefits of short-term solutions with the costs to long-term sustainability. And we'll cover the impact of the drought on population centers, agriculture, and the environment. Finally, of course, we'll talk about conservation strategies. Tonight we'll put the current drought into historical perspective and talk about accompanying water management practices. With rising global temperatures, scientists are calling the current drought the new normal, with a need for new water management practices. To talk about water reality in California and its evolving management practices is Marti Dunlap, a Chico attorney and the founder of the organization Citizens Water Watch of Northern California. Welcome to The Real Issue, Marti Dunlap.
Thank you, Sue.
So, Marti, we're in the 4th year of a pretty severe drought, and I want to ask you, put this into historical context. How unusual for California is a drought like this?
Okay. Well, I'd like to first just put the water cycle into bring it out so we can just talk about that, kind of the physical properties. So basically, what's going to happen is we have evaporation from our oceans and our lakes and our ground. Trees also send off evaporative moisture. Goes into clouds, it condenses, it moves over land, bumps into mountains, then it rains, comes down either as snow or precipitation, goes into our creeks, and then flows back to the oceans and into the lakes. Water is finite. We do not make new water. So it's very important to know that this cycle is a closed cycle. So regarding the perspective of it, there has been some significant droughts that have been measured by tree rings over, they started measuring actually in like 800 all the way up to 2000, and there have been significant droughts in the West from I think 850 to 1050, 200 years, and another 200-year drought also from 1100 to 1300. So certainly there have been significant droughts in the West over time. However, starting in the 1600s, became a very wet period, and particularly in the 1900s, this is the wettest period on record since they started to be able to measure tree rings and determine what this has, how much precipitation actually falls in the West. So we have been in a very wet period since the 1900s. Though we have had droughts throughout this period. So basically our water management practices have evolved based on the wettest time that the West has seen since 800.
Well, let me ask you for a second. You're saying that we have seen in California, we haven't seen, but tree rings show that we've had periods of 200 years at a time in drought conditions, what we would call today drought conditions, for 200 years?
Correct.
And I'm just curious, from one year to the next, is it a slow, is it a gradual move into drought, or is it 1 year it's wet and the next 200 years it's relatively dry?
Well, that is something that seems to be also a moving target. The Department of Water Resources says that it's kind of hard to define drought, but basically it has to do with how much precipitation falls if it's a below normal or average year. So if you have 200 years, then it's probably hard to determine what is actually average. But for us right now, that is what we are basing it on. It's what seems to be average. And so it is, yes, it's a consistent time period.
And it's interesting that you say drought is considered water or precipitation below the average, and so you have to ask what is average, and then throw in the question of if we're in a drought with, we currently have about 35 million people. If we had 100 million people, would we always be in drought? So it is this idea of a moving target.
It is, you're right, and demand is probably one of the things that really pushes this in terms of do we have enough water.
Right.
One of the things I want to say also about the water cycle is that surface water is what we have available to us easily, creeks, streams, lakes, even oceans, whereas groundwater is below the surface, and that is what we're also very concerned about because groundwater and surface water function in a conjunctive manner. The groundwater sustains our creeks and our rivers, holds them up, where our surface water will seep down and feed the ground. So these two systems are actually very complementary to each other. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is the snowpack is a significant part of the California water system because the temperature of the precipitation when it comes down and building the snowpack is a big part of what we do.
And so let's move forward a little bit. One of the things you said is the 19th century brought in a whole lot more water. We've seen a lot more water. And then you also said there have been periods of drought. Not 200-year droughts, but we've seen many. So talk about those droughts and then bring the current drought into the conversation.
Good. So in the 1900s, there were about 31 of 100 years that were drought, so about 31%. Right now, in the year 2000 and on, we've had about 10 years of drought. So we're up to about 62% of those years in a very small period of time. But in terms of the overall perspective, we had drought in the late 1880s and 90s. And based on that, the state started to put pressure on the federal government to do something to help us deal with this issue. And Teddy Roosevelt passed or was signed into law the Reclamation Act in 1902. And that's when we started to manage water in California. So it was based on a drought at that point in time. It's now become the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And that particular entity is the first water management group in California.
You've mentioned to me before that our groundwater practice, our water management practices have always been a result of various droughts. So talk about our groundwater or our water management practices beginning back in the 1800s after that drought. Take us through the evolution of water management in the state.
Okay. So the Bureau of Reclamation came into effect in 1902, and that was to help irrigate irrigable lands in California, as well as to do flood control, because they wanted to start to get more land available for farming purposes. So the big focus was the Central Valley, and the Central Valley is basically divided in half. The northern half is the Sacramento Valley, and the southern half is the San Joaquin Valley. There is more irrigable land in the San Joaquin Valley. About 2/3 of the state land is in San Joaquin Valley, but it only has about 1/3 of the water. The reverse is true in the north, in the Sacramento Valley, where there's about 1/3 of the land to be farmed with about 2/3 of the water. So initially the focus was on the San Joaquin Valley. In the early 1900s, the wells started to go dry in the San Joaquin Valley. So that's when they started to go, okay, we need to do something more here. We need to do dams. We need to move towards moving water around because the wells were not providing enough water for farming at that point in time. So that was really one of the bigger movements towards managing our water was in the 1900s. The next big event.
And that was, let me stop you for a second. It seems like the beginning of water management on a large scale was the question of development. Not necessarily, well, it was water need, but we needed to move it from the north to the south to actually develop our agriculture and to really develop. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. The nation at large, of course, was interested in seeing California develop.
Sure.
Part of the Reclamation Act was to limit farms to 160 acres if you were to be able to get any of the project water. And so any acreage which was larger was not eligible. So they wanted to see people start to divest from large acreages so that they could be providing this development in a smaller farming scale. It didn't quite work out that way, but that was certainly the intention of the federal government. So then we were moving along to the next big drought, which was in 1928 to 34.
Perfect timing with the Great Depression.
It
okay,
was.
Good,
You're
good.
right. It did fit in. And at that point, this is when dams were starting to be built. And they were using the people who could build those types of dams. I think it was the CCC, and that effort was the,
part of the New Deal.
Exactly, the New Deal, the cheap labor, and so huge dams were built, and that's when Shasta was approved. So in 1933 was when the Central Valley Project was passed, and also known as CVP. That's the acronym that most of us know it by. But Shasta Dam was approved to be built at that time. It wasn't completed until after World War II, 1945, but Shasta is the largest dam that we have, part of that project. So at this point, the federal government has now started to set up a system of being able to collect water and move it under the CVP and do contracts with people who are then going to be receiving these allocations from that. So that was, the next drought. What's interesting at that point is it wasn't a drought that brought about the next big change. It was flooding, and that was in 1955. The flooding of the Sacramento River, a number of lives were lost in the Sacramento area. And at that point, the State Water Project, or SWP, came about.
Okay.
And that's all state water. It's all
water.
California water, but it is true that the feds, Bureau of Reclamation, have the CVP, and the state has this, and that's mostly the Feather River.
Right, and so let me ask you, that you said there was, I have never heard of this, the flooding in the Sacramento area. What caused that flooding? Was it just a lot of precipitation that year?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That's what it was based
It's
on.
unpredictable. It's unpredictable weather here in California.
Exactly, and that is something that I want to talk a little bit about. I don't know if this is a good time, but just to finish up talking about the State Water Project, that was to provide water to 25 million people and also water for 750,000 acres of ag land. So that was really a very specific purpose. That's when Shasta Dam was built and completed in 1967.
In the south, to specifically move water from the north to the south. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the California Aqueduct was part of that system.
Okay.
So if we can just take a little detour, let's talk about California rain, because it is very variable. There is a map where it shows how much precipitation varies across the country. Most parts of the country, very stable. This is what they can expect. California and other parts of the West, extremely different. Can't really count on it. It's highly variable. What's interesting about our water management practices based on this variability of our precipitation is that they count on water falling from the sky in California for 5 months, from November to March. 50% of our precipitation is what we receive during that time period. 75% of our precipitation actually falls between December and February, in those 3 months. And in those 3 months, it falls in 15 days. So we are really basing our precipitation in California on getting it in 15 days. And if we don't get the precipitation during those 15 days, we're going to probably be under average. And so we are very different, I think, in our state relative to many other parts of the country, because we are dependent on getting it in a very short period of time.
Right. And we're depending on it to come in the form of snow so that we can use it later in the summertime, and we know that it's quite a problem being, one of the warmest weathers on record.
Right.
And we don't actually have any snow to prepare us for the summer water supply.
The state climatologist has defined climate change as less snowpack, more variability, warmer temperatures, more rain, and more extremes. And so just for 2015, this year, our snowpack is 7% of normal. So we don't have our snowpack, and that's what our water management practices are based on, is having that snowpack so that it melts slowly, fills our reservoirs, so there can be additional releases to the areas that need the water later in the summer.
Right.
Without that snowpack, our water management practices are very different.
And so let's kind of move into where we are today. Is you made the point earlier that in the water cycle conversation, and you connected the surface water to the groundwater, and our entire water management system, our practices are based on snow in the winter melting. We have developed these major water projects to move water throughout the state, to store it in certain times so that we can release it when it's necessary. What's happening with this drought, we're in the 4th year of the drought. What we're seeing is less surface water. We're seeing more people pump groundwater. There's great concern about the overpumping of groundwater. And I was very surprised to find that California has never regulated the pumping of groundwater. And so that, with the new normal, we need new water management practices. And what we have seen come into law is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which just came into effect a few months ago. And basically what that does is, the idea is groundwater is best managed at the local level. And so it calls for entities all over the state to volunteer to become that entity of that location and assess the groundwater situation, monitor it, and somehow regulate the pumping of the groundwater. And the idea is those small entities will work with other entities, and the state groundwater will be managed as a whole. And I want to ask you, I know that you have a lot of problems with this strategy, but I want to ask you, is this a first step? Is this just something that California begins to start monitoring groundwater?
Well, having paid attention to the water situation for a number of years, it has been something that our group, Citizens Water Watch, as well as myself, has just kind of pondered. What's the best way to do this? Because you're right, California is one of the last states in the West to monitor its groundwater, to have some type of statute monitoring that. And although we passed a whole bunch of laws in 2009, it was all on the voluntary basis. And here we are now in this drought, and this major legislation passed in September of 2014, like you're saying. It's huge. And so my first question is, well, who has the right to manage our groundwater? I mean, groundwater is a private property right, so it gets very tricky. But my next question then is, well, who has a duty to manage it?
Okay.
Because obviously it's a very important aspect of survival of our state. So in 1928, California passed Article 10, Section 2, which has to do with the beneficial and reasonable use of water. It provides that all water, surface and groundwater in the state of California, belongs to the people. And it's the duty of the state of California to protect that right, which is the right to this water, reasonable and beneficial use. So it seems reasonable to me that the state would be the entity. Now the state has been managing the water in other ways as well, and so now they have also become responsible to then bring forward this Groundwater Management Sustainability Act to see how it's going to be functional for us.
Can I stop you for a second?
Sure.
Okay, one of the things that you mentioned that I have a hard time really understanding why it works this way. You said groundwater is a property rights issue. And when we're talking about groundwater, let's talk about the Tuscan Aquifer, because it's right here and it's healthy and it's being desired by a lot of folks not in Northern California, and it covers a big chunk of Northern California. And if it's a private property issue and I put a well on my land and I just pump and pump and pump, I'm not just pumping my water, I'm pumping my neighbor's water because it's the same aquifer underneath all of our land. And so help me understand how we can think of that water as being a property rights issue, and to have something like public welfare and the public trust written right into the California Constitution.
So property rights is a near and dear type of right that everyone really holds carefully, because it's a bundle of rights. You have a right to your land, you have a right to everything underneath your land, if you haven't sold your mineral rights, but you definitely have a right to pump water for reasonable and beneficial use on the land there.
That's key. Reasonable and beneficial use, not an endless amount of pumping water. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
But who's monitoring reasonable beneficial use, and who defines it? I mean, we have some different definitions, but certainly as we go further into the world of fracking or other ways of using water, is that a beneficial use if drought is a concern? Right. So yes, that is kind of the issue with groundwater pumping. And right now, like you mentioned, Lower Tuscan, it underlies 4 different counties. Mm-hmm. And over the last maybe 10 years, there has been an effort to try to have conversations with the other counties, Butte, Glenn, Colusa, and Tehama. Okay, how can we work with this together? But you get into cross-jurisdictional issues. So if someone wants to pump groundwater, then if Butte County says no, well, they can put their wells into another county and pump from there. I do feel that that's one of the greatest benefits of the what they call SGMA, the Sustainability Groundwater Management Act, and that is it divides basins up, and it requires all the different entities that draw from that particular basin to come up with a plan.
So it is based on the basins. It's not, okay.
Right.
I thought it was based on counties, but there is some sort of reason to the way that it was divided.
Right. The Department of Water Resources under Bulletin 118 has divided the entire state into sub-basins, and those are all defined where those boundaries are. And so they are requiring actually, that a single plan comes up for each sub-basin. As it turns out, for Butte County, we have, I think, at least 5 basins that overlie another county. Butte, Glenn, Colusa, Tehama, and Sutter. Yuba might even be in there too. But that requires our county to talk to these other entities about how we're going to manage this sub-basin. So it's by sub-basin, not by county. And that is one of the best things about getting people together to start talking about being more responsible and conservative with the use of our water.
Exactly, and coordinating and to monitor together and to figure out how do we work together. So it's putting that straw into the basin, and you know, if one county sucks out too much, then the other county loses. So it, in a way, it does force the people most impacted to take responsibility for their own basin. Marti, I know that you do have real concerns about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and I know one of them is, well, before we go into the time frame, I want to ask you, I know that the Glen Colusa Irrigation District, I think that they would like to be that local entity, and I think one of the concerns is it's a quasi-government agency, but it's a for-profit agency, and so what is your feeling about having a for-profit agency monitoring and overseeing groundwater?
Well, certainly that is one of the concerns. Just back for a second to the state having this duty to protect the water, it makes the state a trustee. Counties also have a duty to be using their police powers to protect the welfare of their citizens. When you get into private entities, they don't have that same type of duty to protect. So certainly that is a concern. It is one of my concerns is what they call the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, or the GSA. Counties can apply to be the GSA, but so can water districts. And you're right, that is a concern. Will water districts really be holding the need to protect that water for the public's use at their heart, because they are for profit, and so it's like the fox watching the hen house. They can pump as much as they want, And are they going to really monitor themselves for the welfare of not only the people, but also the ecosystem, to maintain the land in a way that it's viable and it doesn't turn into a dust bowl type of environment? So that is one of the concerns, is who is the right entity. Some of the powers of these GSAs is huge. They can adopt rules and ordinances. They can do monitoring and metering. They also can revise the boundaries of basins. And so if they start to see an issue, they can be changed. And so I think it is very important that the people that have the duty to the public make sense to be the ones who are doing the or the agency are doing the monitoring and everything that goes with it.
Marti, let me ask you. I want to go back to, you brought up in the beginning, we have seen through tree rings 200 years of drought, and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act just came into effect, and when it becomes fully in place is not for a number of years.
Right.
So talk about the concern there.
Right. So that is one of the big concerns is, okay, this is a great idea, but is this too little too late? There's a lot of plans on the horizon for moving water. The plans aren't due until 2022. Butte County has to have theirs a little bit earlier because it's a high priority, but they also, implementation is not till 2025, but sustainability in our groundwater does not need to be in effect until 2042. So that's a ways off.
That's quite a few years from now.
A lot of groundwater can be pumped. A lot of damage can be done to the ecosystem, to the water. 40% of California is dependent on groundwater. So it's really important that we are paying attention to this now, especially in light of the drought. I do have a couple other concerns.
Very quickly.
Okay, and those are that the plan is exempt from CEQA.
The California Environmental
Quality
Act.
Exactly. As well as there's a big phenomena in states who have groundwater acts, and that is death by 1,000 wells. Wells that are exempt are not going to be monitored. And I think it's really important that we don't kill off our groundwater by having too many exemptions.
Marti, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Sure.
I always do.
Good.
And thank you for joining us on The Real Issue. Tune in next time as we discuss the politics and the economics of California's water.